financial sector bailout as government expenditure, because that expenditure directly adds to the budget deficit and the public.
Well, so the former president, John Dramani Mahama, is addressing a press conference on the state of the economy. We want to cross over now to the office of the former president at Cantonment here in Accra for the event.
Ghana's fiscal deficit position, which includes the bailout, stands at 7.0% for 2018 and is projected to remain at 7.0% by the end of the year 2019. Now, the significance of this is that it breaches government's own Fiscal Responsibility Act, and it is at variance with government's cosmetic position of 3.9% that is quoted for 2018 and a projected outturn for 2019 of 4.7%. Considering government's breaches of its own Fiscal Responsibility Act, one wonders why the president will set up a huge committee to consider the reasons for exchange rate fluctuations. He must be informed that unplanned budget deficits have a bearing on the economy and on the exchange rate depreciation. It is even worrying that this trend of falsified numbers or creative accounting seems to permeate government institutional practices. The Minority Caucus in Parliament have had cause to call out the Bank of Ghana on account of such systematic reporting failures. My brothers and sisters, notwithstanding these infractions which we pointed out in the past, we do not seek vindication, not at all. We are rather concerned about the grave consequences financial misreporting has on the authenticity, credibility, and reliability of data coming from Ghana, particularly within the financial markets. Such misreporting, as revealed by the IMF, can further reduce the confidence that the international community has in Ghana's economy and worsen the excruciating hardships that Ghanaians are currently grappling with. Meanwhile, in a two-phase manner, in the same budget, the government programmed to treat as inflows exceptional revenues such as recoveries from receiverships and proceeds from the ESLA bond. My brothers and sisters, Parliament recently approved 15 billion Ghana cedis to support the cost of the banking sector cleanup. Our estimates show that going by the reckless path this government chose with its attendant job losses and collapse of businesses, an additional 13 billion Ghana cedis will be required to complete the exercise of the financial sector clean-out. This brings the total amount needed for the bailout to about 28 billion Ghana cedis. Now, it's interesting to note, governments did not make any provision for the cost of the banking sector crisis in both the 2020 budget and the 3-year medium-term expenditure framework, the MTEF. There's no provision for the financial sector cleanup. Again, this was done to dishonestly lower the projected budget deficit and give a false picture of satisfactory fiscal performance in 2020, which is an election year. This is what a nation reaps when it has a president who thinks predominantly about the next election and not putting things right, not about the impact of his decisions on the people. Again, it had to take the IMF to give Ghana a further indication of the extent of the bailout cost in future years, a figure which the government that just exited an IMF program have been compelled to give to the fund. And so we received the figure from the fund, not from our own government. Is that to suggest that they had not planned to pay depositors who have their monies locked up following the needless closure of the banks? Or is government treating the cost as unbudgeted expenditure? Ladies and gentlemen, note that the president in his Christmas message to Ghanaians was very emphatic that all depositors will receive their locked up funds in the defunct banks in full. Emphasis mine, in full. If I may ask, on which foundation was the president's promise anchored? Was it just a vain promise? I suggest to the president that the systematic obfuscation of facts with the intention to hoodwink Ghanaians is a source of worry, because it defeats the already low confidence that people have in our political system and our democracy. It is clear he cannot add to the gains Therefore, we must not allow him to continue to subtract from it any further beyond 2020. Countrymen and women, in another vein, the IMF declined to treat the energy sector cost as amortization rather than as arrears, against what government stated in the 2020 mid-year review and the 2020 budget. This was another attempt at obfuscation. You may recall that during the 2019 mid-year budget statement, government announced its decision to treat the crystallized energy sector payments to the independent power producers as an amortization item, hence making it a below-the-line fiscal operation, and so not captured on the budget. And I quote the finance minister. I said, Mr. Speaker, the crystallization of energy contingent liabilities in respect of take-or-pay contract obligations with IPPs, estimated at 5.1 billion for 2019, is being amortized, thus increasing the requirement for external amortization above the amount originally provisioned for in the 2019 budget. This is on 29 of the budget statement, paragraph 139, unquote. Technically, as the minority in Parliament and other fiscal experts have noted, the crystallized energy liabilities directly added 5.1 billion Ghana cedis to the arrears, and therefore the deficit, it can therefore not be treated as below the line item. It must be an above the line item. We have in the past made reference to the glossary of the Government Finance Statistics Manual of 2014 of the IMF to expose the position of government on the treatment of the energy sector payments as amortization. It is therefore not surprising that the IMF exercised its authority under Article 4 of its Constitution and declined to treat such expenditure as amortization. So if you look at the latest IMF report, it has brought the energy sector cost above the line. And that is why you see different figures between the IMF's figures and the government's figures. Now, factoring and non-processing of expenditure through the GIFMIS to reduce budget deficits. I mentioned this several months ago in London and said that some payments were being made off GIFMIS in order to keep them off budget. Government has since 2018 resorted to an unorthodox way of paying government contractors, which bypasses the Ghana Integrated Financial Management System, Information System, GIFMIS, with the aim of creating the impression that they are reducing government expenditure. Government negotiated with contractors under duress to pay arrears owed them through private borrowing from Fidelity Bank and other sources. Government's liabilities to contractors were discounted at a rate between 10 and 14%. The bank took the invoice value of both current and non-current liability arrears of the contractors in return for treasury notes and bonds from the Ministry of Finance without parliamentary approval. So this is borrowing without parliamentary approval. The increased public debt and budget deficit by the size of the amount of the invoice value held by the bank. Unfortunately, the treatment of this amount outside the fiscal framework has allowed the minister to complete and neutralize the offset of about 5 billion Ghana cedis from end 2016. But this was not captured as expenditure in the fiscal framework of government in 2017, 2018, and 2019. I invite our financial and economic analysts and experts to go through the books as far back as financial year 2000 and beyond, and there will be no such item you will find in the fiscal tables and programs. Now, why is government engaged in these games of playing with the numbers? It is to reduce the size of the fiscal deficit by the size of the overall factoring cost, not accounted for in 2017 to 2019 fiscal years, and likely into 2020. This type of financial arrangement and representation is alien to our fiscal regime. This transaction arrangement has been hidden from Ghanaians. The IMF, reputable local foreign analysts, and all our investors. And so it's only the finance ministry that knows how it is playing with these figures. Therefore, if the transaction cost of the factoring arrangement is captured as additional expenditure, the overall fiscal deficit should be in the region of 8% of GDP for 2018 and 2019. if you make the corrections that the IMF is making. And even the IMF has not added the factoring, which is what is being paid by Fidelity Bank. If you add that, they are talking about 8%. But IMF is even saying the fiscal deficit is 7%. Government is saying it is 4.5%. Let me state for the avoidance of that the official fiscal deficit for 2016 was 7.8% at old GDP, and if you use the rebase figure, 6.5% of rebased GDP. This is verifiable from the Ministry of Finance website. And if you go on the website, gov't, you'll see the figures there. Let me also emphasize that this figure does not include the reversal of the January 2017 interest payment for the NPP backdated to December 2016. There's a backdate of those interest payments. In essence, even though the government has been trumpeting unprecedented fiscal consolidation that occurred in 2016, it is clear that the 2016 deficit was far better than the current fiscal position for 2018 and 2019, as reported by the IMF using the rebased GDP series. Fellow Ghanaians, the NPP government, with 3 oil fields under its management, did not inherit an economy in a dire strait after all. Therefore, President Akufo-Addo should be grateful to Ghanaians for the investment that they made in the petroleum sector prior to 2017. Prior to 2017, Ghana had just 1 oil field, which was the Jubilee field, because of the investment that was made prior to 2017 under the previous administration. We have 2 additional fields, the 10 field and the ENI Sankofa field, which are bringing in far more revenue than we used to receive before in 2016. And that is what is accounting for the growth in the oil sector and all the touting we're doing of Ghana being the fastest growing economy in Africa is because mostly of oil growth. Ladies and gentlemen, worsening public debt and higher debt servicing situation. Ghana's debt situation has deteriorated. This administration has increased the public debt from 120 billion Ghana cedis as at end December 2016 to 218 billion Ghana cedis. This represents an addition of 98 billion Ghana cedis in the last 3 years only. And I add with very little to show. Debt service as a share of domestic revenue and total expenditure has increased significantly to 60% and 45% respectively at the end of 2019. They were just about 51.9% and 32% respectively in 2016. You can verify this information again from the website of the Ministry of Finance, and I stated the website address. These are worrying developments that must be given careful consideration. And yet, government is increasingly borrowing to consume and not to invest in infrastructure and production. In this regard, even before the IMF adjustments, the rate of accumulation of public debt was also beginning to show an increased trend, despite Nana Akufo-Addo's pre-election promise to the contrary, that government was not going to borrow. My fellow countrymen and women, even with 3 oil fields and rebased GDP, this terrible trend of consumption-driven borrowing will not reverse anytime soon, and it is the main danger to the sustained growth of our economy. Countrymen and women, inappropriate utilization of Eurobond proceeds. Despite inflows of oil revenue and high levels of borrowing, most payments go into consumption. This contrasts with the massive investments in the projects that were done by the previous administration, especially infrastructure, social, and economic. In fact, the previous administration invested in educational infrastructure than a government that touts education at its highest priority. We built more schools, existing secondary schools, e-blocks for community day schools, basic schools, removal of schools under trees with relatively lower inflows from borrowed funds and just 1 oil field. We built hospitals, we built roads, we expanded telecom infrastructure, just name them. As a typical example, the NDC used the flow of petroleum and sovereign bond revenues under its watch to complement the construction of the Ituabo gas plants, Terminal 3 airport projects, schools, roads, water systems, extension of electricity, and to repay 500 million out of the 750 million of Ghana's first 2007 bond, which was contracted under the Kufuor administration, if you remember. We left money in the sinking fund to retire that bond in 2017 when we had left office. And so when somebody says his father didn't leave him anything, he left him money to pay a debt that was outstanding. Surprisingly, this government's capital expenditure is fast dwindling despite resources from 2 additional oil fields, namely the 10 field and Sankofa field, and an existing oil field, which is the Jubilee field, with outputs currently exceeding 190,000 barrels of oil per day, and revenues peaking from below 1 billion Ghana cedis in 2016. We did not earn up to 1 billion Ghana cedis from the Jubilee field to, above several billions. Can you imagine that in 2018, the government borrowed 5.1 billion Ghana cedis from the Eurobond market, but used 1.2 billion Ghana cedis to support capital expenditure? And can you also imagine that 13.6 billion was borrowed, but used only 418 million Ghana cedis to support capital expenditure in 2019? As if these are not toxic enough, sadly, the government has programmed to borrow the equivalent of 17.1 billion Ghana cedis from the Eurobond market this year. But only 740 million Ghana cedis is supposed to be used to support capital expenditure. Where can an economy be going with this kind of prioritization? 17.1 billion, and you're budgeting only 740 million for capital expenditure. This clearly shows government's increasing appetite for borrowing highly denominated currency for consumption. Ladies and gentlemen, now let's talk about cocoa production and the cocoa sector. Prior to 2017, cocoa production was on a consistent rise for 3 consecutive years. In fact, cocoa output reached its second highest in the 2016-2017 year after we recorded the 1 million tons, if you remember, output. This was due to good policies implemented to increase cocoa farmers' access to fertilizers and other inputs, including new seedlings, free seedling project. Yes, free fertilizers, seedlings, and other inputs were distributed to farmers. Measures were also put in place by gov't to ensure that fertilizers and inputs given to farmers were tailored to their farm sizes. We measured their farms, and then we gave them the inputs to meet their farm sizes. But since this government took over, annual production has continued to decline with no sign of improvement. Production has declined significantly and precipitously. Production declined from 969,500 metric tons, where we left it in the last production year, to 811,250 metric tons, a shortfall of over 150,000 metric tons. The paradox of the declining trend is that we're constantly being told of the programs and interventions, including artificial pollination on a large scale, and yet output is consistently declining. Another sad development is that PBC Limited, which plays a very critical role in the supply chain of the cocoa industry, is collapsing. gov't depends on licensed buying companies to purchase the cocoa beans from cocoa farmers and hands it over to the board. All the takeover centers in Tema are the takeover centers in Tema and Kumasi. It is therefore unfortunate to note that the performance of Ghanaian-owned companies in this section of the supply chain is dwindling under this government. Ghanaian-owned licensed buying companies, their role in purchasing cocoa is dwindling. Ladies and gentlemen, PBC, a company with SNIT and GOG as majority shareholders, which used to be the largest buyer of cocoa from farmers under my administration, is suffocating under debt, and it is collapsing. The beneficiaries are foreign companies that are taking over the role that was played by PBC before. Meanwhile, government keeps touting local content and job creation. A new NDC administration will ensure that all cocoa farmers have access to all the necessary inputs according to their farm size in order to raise production. We'll revert to the pricing formula that ensured that the farmer was placed first and earned 70% of the international market price for cocoa. We will not abandon cocoa roads for 3 years only to come back and carry them out at a higher cost, and for election year purposes, cut short for cocoa roads. We'll also strengthen cocoa processing companies to add greater value to our cocoa, increase the number of companies that are processing cocoa in order that we can earn more money to stabilize our foreign exchange. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you, and as has become the style of these John Mahama live sessions, I'll be taking questions from my guests who are here in the studio, veteran financial journalists and economists, and also taking some questions from our online guests. And I'll start with my friends and my colleagues. I call you colleagues because I also have media training in here. So what you do is you just catch my eye, you tell me your name, you mention your media house, and then you can ask whatever question you want about the economy. Thank you and welcome once again. Yep.
That based on your deficit is around 8%. So what government is reporting is not accurate. In recent times, this particular ratings with your challenge of the government's figures that have been given so far?
The challenge is not my figures. I'm saying there's a discrepancy between the IMF figures and government figures. And I'm calling on government to reconcile the two. And I've given the reason between the two figures. It is because government is cooking the books. It's not accounting for some figures that should be on budget. They're treating them offline and online. IMF has realized this and brought all that above line. So you're showing a deficit of 7%. And I'm saying that if you add the factoring, which is the payment of contractors using the fidelity system, it takes the budget deficit to even 8%. So it's not me saying it. My challenge is government should come and explain the difference between the last Article 4 figures that IMF has issued and the current figures that government, has given us. And the point I'm making is Moody's would probably have looked at government's figures and used government figures to do their rating. But for a company like Moody's, my thinking is that they would look at the IMF figures too and say, but what is this discrepancy? Was our adjustments of government's credit rating, based on the figures that we have seen, was it justified? It's for them to determine. Because even if you take the reserve figures, there's a discrepancy in the reserve figures. Government is putting its reserve figures at about $8 billion. IMF is putting government's international reserve figures at above 5-point-something billion. So there's a discrepancy in the figures. Government says 8-point-something billion covers 3-point-something% of imports. IMF believes that our reserve figures cover 2-point-something% of imports. So there's a huge discrepancy in the figures. We have always tried to align our fiscal with the international institutions in order to create transparency. You need transparency in order that investors can have trust in your economy. But where there's no transparency and there are discrepancies in the figures that you are putting out. And I remember our minority in parliament has called out the Bank of Ghana and said that the figures they are putting out are cooked. And so government should come clean and tell us what is happening. And that is what I've put to you today.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. President. My name is Erika Hianyu. I work for TVXYZ and Power FM. I want to stay with the issues about debt and then how we are reporting figures with regards to how government is churning out, how much it is borrowing and how much it is spending. I've seen the IMF documents and I've also read around Moody's report. I have also seen concerns raised by the IMF, especially with regards to the rate at which we are borrowing, and most especially issues with the deficit you just made reference to. Now, in your presentation, you made reference to post-2020, and in 2021, if you become the president, I believe that many people will be looking at what you intend to do and how you want to manage the reality of the financial situation of this country today. How are you going to reconcile the two with reference to promises you'll be making as you have even started as we sit here, and how you want to deal with the reality as far as the books will be concerned, especially with reference to the misreported figures as you've made reference to, and what you think must be the actual situation on the ground?
As I said in the discourse that I just had, is that we are borrowing and spending on consumption, not on production and infrastructure. The best way to borrow is to invest in capital expenditure, because then that gingers productivity and increases your ability to be able to repay the debts you are taking. Unfortunately, this is not happening under this government. The bulk of the borrowing is going into consumption. And so the growth and all that is not reflecting in the real sector. Because if you are investing in capital expenditure and infrastructure and production, you see an increase in growth in the real sector. Unfortunately, all the growth that they are touting, the 7% growth, something percent growth, is all coming from increased oil production and increased revenue from oil production. And if you are getting increased revenue from oil production, you must be channeling it, as the PRMA says, into capital expenditure. Unfortunately, that's not happening. All the increased monies that we're getting in terms of oil is going into consumption. And so you can't run a sustainable economy based on borrowing, increased revenues, and investing in consumption rather than in the real sector. And so we'll have to realign that whole fiscal framework. It's going to be tough. And so for me, I'm thinking post-2021, and thinking about the budget post-2021 and the adjustments and reforms that have to be made to make the growth that we have sustainable. And so we have a policy working group working on that. Eventually, we'll give you all the details and all that. But we want government to be transparent so that we don't take over and say, oh, after all, the accounting that was done was not real. And that's why we're drawing your attention to it. So that government will come and tell us what are the real figures. We don't want to take over and day two, we say, oh, the deficit was actually 9% and not 4.9% as government, had indicated. So these are the issues that I have raised. But I think that was a very good question.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now, proud to the 2016, my name is Modiana Ninate and I'm reporting for Pan-African Television. Proud to the 2016 election, Dr. Bawumia was eloquent, just as he was passionate in running and ruining your administration. And he managed to talk about the economy, and how sure, and I know you recall that during your administration, he came up with a description given to you by the NPP as an incompetent government. And through that also gave birth to the famous quote from Baobia that the fundamentals of the economy are weak, the exchange rate will expose you. It's been 3 years now, almost 4 years to his administration of the NPP. How would you assess their management of the economy, just opposing same to yours?
Well, thank you very much. I remember that when those comments were made, I said to my brother, Dr. Baumia, and his flag bearer, Nana Akufo-Addo, that they had never run a country before, and they had never been president before, and so they don't know the challenges of managing that position. I'm sure today they see the reality, and I'd have hoped that Baumia will give another lecture at Central University and say some of the same theoretical things he used to say. You don't run an economy from textbooks. You don't run an economy with economic lectures. Running an economy takes practical work, determination, and prioritization. Public finance is a completely different thing. You need to work at it. You need to understand it. You need to see where public resources should be channeled to give you the best outcomes. And that's why when we're in government, one of the things we did with my finance minister, he's here, we said that, look, we cannot continue piling on the public debt. We must find a way where that public debt is sustainable, and we put in place mechanisms where when we borrow the debt can pay for itself. Terminal 3, we did off government debt. Ghana Airport Company went and borrowed it. They said, look, give us our 60% of the passenger service levy you take from us. And if you give it to us, we'll build Terminal 3 and we will finance the project ourselves. I saw the finance minister. I said, Finance Minister, can you give them back their 60%? Because the passenger service levy was $100 per passenger. And government was taking $60 and giving them $40. And so Ghana Airport Company was financing all their operations with $40 of passenger service levy. So he said, oh, we factored it into the budget this year. So I assured them that in 2016, we'll give them back their $60. And so they can start negotiating for it. They did. They negotiated for it. They got Stanbic, African Development Bank, and all of them to come on board as a consortium and finance Terminal 3. The next budget, we took out their $60, 60% of revenue, and restored their full revenue. And they put it into a collateralized account, a debt service account. And so Terminal 3 is there. Their money is going there. Every whatever the agreement is, the banks are taking out their financing. So it's this innovative kind of borrowing. We can do dualization of our major roads and toll them, and collateralize the tolls, make the tolls to be collected better in terms of reducing human discretion. Let people buy their toll tickets in advance, put a sticker on their car. When they get to the toll booth, it'll open by itself. You don't need somebody to press a button and open it. And then the money that is paid goes into a collateral account to pay for the cost of the road. And so it takes innovation and smart thinking to be able to do all these. They hadn't been in government before. They were very naive, asked 170 theoretical questions. Then today you come and set up 40-man committee to understand why the Forex is. I mean, first year university students will tell you why the CD is declining against foreign exchange. And so you don't need that Forex committee. We all know why it is depreciating. If you have higher demand for foreign exchange against supply, it will depreciate. If you have an economy that is import dependent and you're not exporting enough, your foreign exchange position will depreciate. You don't need a committee to come and tell you this. A lecturer friend of mine, and I'll publish an assignment he gave to first-year economic students, and he asked them, if you were on the 40-member committee, what would you assign to the CD depreciation? And they did the assignment and they analyzed it. I have a copy. I'll publish it on my Facebook so that everybody will see. First-year university students have analyzed why the CD is depreciating. Why do you need a 40-man, committee to tell you why the CD is depreciating?
Okay, thank you very much.
So, yeah.
Okay, let's go here. Then after that, we'll come to you and then to you.
Thank you very much, Excellency. I will start from where you just left off. First-year university student will be able to analyze why the CD has been depreciating. Now, I believe, I remember some of your promises you made when the CD depreciation actually started running around 2013, 2014. Yes. And I would like to know just a couple of sub-questions under this. Cedi depreciation, banking sector crisis, how would you have handled them differently if you were in power? Then also, under your government, ESLA was introduced and the Infrastructure Development Fund were introduced under your government. How do you see the management and the delivery on the real intent for the setting up of these today, and how would you have done those differently if you were in power? My name is Justice Lee Aduboy. I report for the Xinhua News Agency of China and CNC Television.
Xinhua.
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much. We introduced certain new innovations. One was Exim Bank, if you remember. That was supposed to leverage financing to expand exports, to expand exports. Because one of the things you need to do to stabilize your currency is that you must export more and bring in the foreign currency that you need. And so we introduced the Exim Bank, Ghana Exim. And we started to accumulate money in it. And the intention was that the money should go into the productive sector to boost exports. Since we left office, I don't know how that fund is being managed, but obviously, I mean, I don't think that we're seeing any real benefit from Exim's injection into the export sector. And some of the money is going into hotels and other things. You wonder whether those are the real priorities to expand, your exports. We introduced the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund. And the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund was supposed to serve as our sovereign fund. And we're supposed to leverage it in order that we can borrow for infrastructure development. Some of the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund money, we left about $270 million. We put it in UBA. I hear part of the money was taken and put in Unibank. And when Unibank collapsed, part of that money went with the Unibank collapse. Aside from that, you don't know what GIF really has been used for. And it's not serving the purpose for which it was put. Then we also set up the sinking fund. And the sinking fund was meant to contain money so that as and when our debts fall due, we would be able to, amortize those debts without any major problem to the economy. So before we left office, we left money in the sinking fund. And as I said in my statement, that was the money that was used to retire the first Kufuor Eurobond. If you remember, it was 700 and something million. It fell due in 2017. And if we hadn't left money in there, the new government that came in August, September would have had to cough up $500 million, which it wouldn't have. And so we made sure that that money was left there. Of course, we hope we'll win the election. And so we didn't want to win the election and come, and then the money is due, and then we don't have it. So we put it there. And so when this government came, I mean, it was easy for them to sort out the first Eurobond and all that. Unfortunately, same is not being done. What we did was we capped the stabilization fund. So any excess in the stabilization fund was automatically transferred. So these were all innovations that we brought in to ensure a better management of the economy. Unfortunately, I cannot say same for now. And so if you just have growth that is being fueled because you have additional oil revenue, and because of that you say we're the fastest growing economy in Africa, and so on and so forth, you understand? And all you're doing is spending on consumption. You're not improving the roads. All the hospitals that were being built to improve access to health care, you have brought them to a standstill. And instead you are glorifying in distributing ambulances. Where do ambulances take sick people? They take them to hospitals. And so our priority it should be to finish the hospitals so that if an accident happens and you pick the patient, you have a good facility to send them to. And yet, Famina Hospital, Kumawu Hospital, Abetifi Hospital, Bekwai Hospital, Tepa Hospital, Upper West Regional Hospital in Wa, Bogatanga Hospital, all those hospitals we started. University of Ghana Medical Center, Bank Hospital, International Maritime Hospital have all come to a standstill. And yet you are distributing ambulances. And so you pick the person and send them where? And they say there's no bed. And then you get there, they have to put a plastic chair in accident and emergency for the people to sit in. I mean, there's a complete loss of prioritization. And it's not the first time ambulances have been given. In 2012, 2013, we brought 161 ambulances. We did not make posters and say we're distributing ambulances and so on and so forth. You know, yes, you have brought ambulances, fine. We brought ambulances, we brought fire engines. Almost every district got a fire engine. I didn't go and stand and make posters that I was distributing fire engines. You know, there are many other things that we did without, I mean, it's government's obligation to do it. We gave the police more than 1,000 vehicles, the highest number of vehicles the police have ever had in the history of Ghana. Do you remember that I went and stood and touted it to high heaven? These are things that government must do, but we must get our priorities right.
His Excellency, banking, I really want to. I really want to.
Let's take it.
Okay. My name is
my
George
question.
That's
actually my questions. I want to add a follow-up. Sorry.
I want to take you to the cocoa production area. You talked of things that issues that you initiated to improve cocoa production in Ghana. But I think they were somehow stalled after the change of the government. What detailed plan do you have in 2021 if you become president of Ghana again for the sector?
You see, the thing about agriculture is that if you put inputs, you will reap the output. If you put input, the correct input, in the period of gestation of the product, you will reap the output. But if you pretend that you are putting the input and you're not putting it in, the output will expose you. And that's exactly what's happening. I mean, if this government is doing well with inputs into cocoa sector, why is cocoa production dwindling? We noticed a reduction in cocoa production, and so we said, look, why do we sell the fertilizer to the farmers? Let's give it to them. Because if you ask them to buy it, he will say he doesn't have money and he won't apply the fertilizer. If he doesn't apply the fertilizer, the cocoa output drops. So give it to him for free. Once he asks it for free, he will apply it. And when he applies, his output will go up. And if output goes up, you'll be able to buy more cocoa. And that's why we brought the free fertilizer program. Not only in terms of increasing output of existing cocoa plantations or farms, but also to give farmers, and especially young people, the advantage to come into cocoa production. So we distributed 60 million seedlings. The first year we distributed 20 million seedlings. The next year we increased it to 60 million seedlings. Volta region, especially the OT part from Hohoi upwards, a lot of people don't know it's a cocoa growing area. In the colonial time, they used to produce cocoa. Unfortunately, it dwindled. And so we set up a seedling farm there. And we recruited young cocoa farmers and we gave them the seedlings because we wanted to boost the cocoa production in that area from less than 5,000 tons. Our aim was to boost it to 50,000 tons, 10 times. And then all the other regions, we set up these seedling banks, and the farmers were taking the seedlings for free. They didn't pay for them. In addition, we said, look, anytime we go for consortium financing, let's take additional money. Let's reserve $150 million for cocoa roads so that we can improve the roads in the 5 cocoa growing regions so that when the cocoa is produced, we can send transport in there and take the cocoa out. And so we gave contracts to farmers to do cocoa roads, and they started work. And the new government came and terminated it, refused to pay them. There are several contractors who are doing cocoa roads who have died. Some are sick, they can't pay for their hospital bills because government says we're investigating the roads. And for 3 years, they refused to pay the contractors. Some of the roads that they did, and you know cocoa grows in the place where you have the highest rainfall. And so there are places where they gravel the road, preparing it for bitumen, and government says stop work. Today, if you go, all that gravel is washed away. If you want to go and do that road again, you have to come and spend more money to do that road. Some of the contractors today owe the banks. Their equipment have been seized. And today, even some of the banks that gave them the money to go and do the contracts have collapsed and are under receivership. So you say you're paying contractors. As soon as you release money to them, the money is in his name and the receiver's name. And the receiver says, I'm not interested in giving you money to go back to that contract. My job is to collect the money that you owe the bank. So you pay the contractor 5 million Ghana cedis, and the receiver takes all the 5 million Ghana cedis. Yet you say, oh, we paid the contractor, so they're going back to work. Oh, your contractor is coming back because we paid him 5 million cedis. He doesn't have the money to go back. That is the reality. And so when President Akufo-Addo says, oh, we paid your husband's money, so Christmas will be good. Ask the contractors. Christmas was the worst Christmas they've ever had, you know. And yet, the expectation that they've created with your family is that, oh, you've been paid. And so the suspicion is that, oh, if you've been paid, then you are taking the money somewhere else. And it's not good. It's not good for our politics, you know.
Mine is a follow-up to the cocoa sector, still the cocoa sector. Yeah.
And the banking crisis, banking sector crisis, yeah.
And then I will just talk about it.
We'll take 3 more, and then we'll go online for a little while, and then we'll come out.
Okay.
So let's take the cocoa. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, so my name is Najak Bliago with GBC Radio. Yeah, still on the cocoa sector. One thing that comes to mind is that PBC is at the brink of collapse, almost off, if not dead. And legacy debts has been one of the main problems affecting the company. Workers have demonstrated they're not being paid for months and all that. Talking about policies that you are streamlining, should you come to power in 2021 or the years ahead, what stringent measures are you going to put in place to revamp PBC?
Yeah. Okay. PBC is a state-owned enterprise that we all have known as a major player in the cocoa sector for years. And what we did was PBC floated as a company on the stock exchange, and Ghanaians invested in it. And in our time, PBC was the largest buyer of cocoa. They had a fleet of trucks. That company, we took it, it was moribund, we rebuilt it. Aside from being able to buy so much cocoa, they also even set up a share butter processing plant in Bupe. And so it was like PBC was growing by leaps and bounds. Today, PBC is a sorry state of itself. And it's not only PBC. Most state-owned enterprises that were handed over to this government are in a very, very sorry state. Bost, when we took Bost, was highly indebted. Bost bounced back, paid off a lot of its debts, restructured itself, and Bost started exporting petroleum products to Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso from the Bolga depot. And they were bringing into Bank of Ghana something like $6 million every 2 weeks from petroleum sales to neighboring countries. Today, that business has collapsed. If you go to the Bolga depot, there's no truck there. They're not loading from Bolga depot. So they're dispatching petroleum from here. And when they dispatch the petroleum, somehow it's meant for export. So they don't pay the taxes, ESLA and all that, and then it disappears into the system. And it's sold at the prevailing rates. And so people are making more money. And I saw recently they said MPA has saved Ghana how many, this. No, that thing is still happening. Vehicles are being taken as export products, petroleum, and they're being sold in the system, and people are making money out of them. But PBC can be resuscitated if we have dedicated leadership, and if government encourages it and works to protect, state enterprises. Unfortunately, that is not the case. I mean, this government doesn't seem interested in state enterprises, and I can understand because they are a conservative government. They believe in private ownership of everything. They don't believe that the state should be involved in anything. We believe that there should be a competition between the state and private. And so there are state-owned enterprises that would do well. I mean, if you take JoyNews Distilleries has survived. It is providing employment. It is competing with Casapreco and all of them. You understand? And in our time, JoyNews Distilleries was one of the best performing state-owned enterprises. They pay their own salaries. They look after themselves. They don't rely on government for anything. It was the same with PBC, the same with Bost, But today, if you take away the Bost margin, Bost will collapse like a pack of cards, unfortunately.
Okay.
Yes.
Your Excellency, I am for
There was
banking.
A question on the banking sector.
Yes, I have a follow-up. I want to find out, when you were in power, how much was injected to address the toxic in the sector? And as we are seeing the cleanup now, it didn't happen when you were there. I also want to find out, give us in concrete terms what you would do differently to ensure people don't lose their jobs. As it stands, the issue of unemployment continues to remain a worry, and not just those in the banking sector, but even those of us who sit at the back. How are you going to handle such a situation and ensure it doesn't really happen again?
When we're in government, the red flag was being waved on the banking sector. And so we started the processes for bringing things back on track. And so we started the depositors insurance scheme and all the other laws that we passed in order to improve the regulation of the banking and financial sectors. Unfortunately, we left office before all those measures we were taking could crystallize. Now a new government comes, they look at the situation. I don't know whether they panicked or whatever happened, but certainly the route they took was extreme, it was harsh, and I think they've created more harm than they have solved. One, the posture of the Bank of Ghana and government officials helped to increase the insolvency of the banks. Because if you come into office and you say, if you don't increase your reserves to 400 million, we're giving you this period. If you don't, we'll close you down. And then you're posturing and letting people know that the banks are insolvent and all that. You're making all kinds of things. Then people who have their monies in the bank begin to wonder, what if this bank collapses? And look, there's no bank. If you have a run on a bank, take Lloyd's or any bank. No bank has 100% of depositors' money sitting down so that when they come and ask for it, you give it to them. Because they invest the money. And that is why when you come, not everybody will come one day and ask for his money. And so as they invest the money brings profit and the bank grows. So if you create an atmosphere where people do not have trust in the banks and they believe that there's something going to happen to these banks, everybody will come and take their money out. And that's what started happening. I have a banker friend, he said, I don't know what's happening. Anytime we open the doors, everybody's coming to take money. Nobody is coming to deposit. And that is because the government has said, we're giving you a deadline. Even before the deadline had reached, they kept touting it and saying, by this time, if you don't, then the banks will go, oh, we've got this investor who want to do this and that. And then they created all kinds of situations that were not the best. Now, what we will do, and I said it in my other Facebook Live, is that we will work to restore the participation of indigenous Ghanaian business in the financial sector. Because the financial sector is critical. And finance is something that everywhere in the world, every country makes sure that the finance sector, it has indigenous participation. When we came into office, all the big banks were foreign owned. It was a deliberate policy to allow Ghanaians to invest in the financial sector. And that is why we encouraged UT was a savings and loan company. We encouraged them to take a banking license and become a bank. Unibank was encouraged to set up a bank. All the banks, the Ghanaian banks that were set up, we did not have them. We had Nigerian banks, Access, Guarantee Trust Bank, and all the other, Zenith Bank and others. Then you had the top tier banks, Barclays, Stanbic, EcoBank, Stanchart, and all of them. There were no Ghanaian banks, except for Prudential and a few of them. And so it was a deliberate policy to increase Ghanaian participation in the banking sector. Today, that is wiped out.
Mr. President, I wanted to just stampede and ask a follow-up related question.
Yes.
I'm sorry to do this.
I was just going to wrap it up. Just 1 minute.
All right.
So we will restore Ghanaians' investment in the financial sector, and we'll do it this way. All banks do not cater to the same segment of the market. Yeah? There are top banks that cater to a certain segment of the market. There are smaller banks. If you go anywhere in the world, there are different banks with different capitalization that cater to different segments of the market. You can't come out and say every bank must have 400 million capital reserve. It's not necessary. You can have different tiered banks, and that is what we're going to do. We're going to have 3-tiered banking system. We'll have Class C banks, $80 million capital reserve. You are in this segment of the market. You are a regional bank or something. You can have Class B banks, $200 million capital reserve. You are in this segment of the market. And then you can have the Class A banks, the huge banks, $400 million and above. And everybody would be, you just have to improve regulation, that's all. And so our policy working group is working on how to regulate the banking system, but to let everybody enter at the segment of the market that they want to do. The big banks, the Class A banks, are not good at SME lending because they can't handle the risk. The indigenous banks were better at handling the risk at the SME level than the bigger banks. And so our policy working group is working on these, and at the right time we'll bring all those out. But I think that government pushed this too quickly. It has created a huge debt for the taxpayer, almost 30 billion cedis to guarantee depositors' funds. And the point is, there's no way, the president has said, we'll pay depositors in full. That is not going to happen in 2020. If government even will pay that money, it's going to be spread out over the next 4 years. And so depositors cannot sit and think that this year they're going to get their money. But of course, we believe that because of what government did, we do owe depositors the right to receive their monies back. And when I come into government, we will make sure that we pay depositors their money in the shortest possible time.
Mr. President, the question I wanted to ask is that we've seen documents suggesting that the collapse of some of these banks were deliberate.
Yes.
And it is not related to what has come out this week about Unibank. We've heard and seen documents related to even facilities owned by Indum and other related personalities owning MFIs. Will your government, if you come to power in 2021, be interested in investigating the real cause of the collapse of some of these banks?
Yeah. The thing is, with some of the banks, we cannot say that everybody worked above board and did not contribute to the state in which some of the banks were. And so we need to investigate that and isolate that. But then we also need to look at the other issues. You know, was government too hasty because of some other reason that we don't know? I don't want to attribute bad faith to anybody. But like you're saying, there are little things that we're seeing. You know, I mean, recently I saw this Attorney General's opinion about the closure of Unibank. And the point is, if it's real, I don't know, and that's why I'm being very careful with what I say. If that document is authentic and the Attorney General said it's not legal to close this bank and all that, why would we have done what we did? And couldn't we have given the banks time to realign their position, bring them back on board? There are some that were moribund that you could close, yes, but I believe that there are some that could have been saved. You know, you close a bank because the owner has another case of fraud against him before the court. So because of that, you know, whatever investment he made in the bank must have been fraudulent. And so you close the bank. There are banks that were not insolvent, that were closed. You know, and so the question is, what was the underlying motive behind the closure of all these banks? It is important for the people of Ghana to know. And if we come into office, we're going to take every single, did they go through the procedure? What were the procedures they should have gone through? And if they didn't go through the procedure, I mean, people have legal rights that they can resort to.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Okay, yes, you have been waiting for a long time.
My name is...
wow, I have a lot of questions coming.
My name is Eko Moses. I report for Bloomberg. Your Excellency, do you regret signing on to an IMF program that overlapped an election, given that you front-loaded all the, what I call the economic bitter pill?
Yeah.
Therefore, there's a school of thought that what we see now, the growth that we see, was a scientific consequence of the decisions that had been taken as part of the IMF program.
Yes.
So one, do you regret doing that? And then two, you're in a country where 50% of our revenue goes to pay debt. The rest pay salary. Then there's almost nothing left.
Is it 50%? It's more than...
Now it is more. Now we have leverage oil. It's gone. cocoa is technically gone because they've taken loads of loans. Then gold is also on the verge of going because there's an IPO that is coming up that's reaching up to about 750 million.
Based on the royalties from gold.
Precisely. Yeah. Then the last bit is bauxite, which is also on the verge. All things being equal.
To the Chinese,
now, what space will you have to prosecute your projects in the event that you win the next election?
This is exactly what Ghanaians should know, that this government is mortgaging the future of this country for today's spending. You've listed them all, and that is the danger we face. Because look at gov't, they are mortgaging gov't receipts for the next, how many years, 10 years or so, and so it means that in future, there will be no gov't revenues to look at. They are looking at taking our 10% reserve in gold investments and our royalties and mortgaging it and taking loans against it. You see, for a government that said you can develop this country without borrowing, it is the greatest political con that Ghanaians have ever been subjected to. ESLA, which we introduced, which was criticized, was going to be collateralized for 5 to 7 years to pay off legacy energy sector debt. They came and decided that the structure we had put, they didn't want it, so they discarded it. Stanbic was the lead bank, and all the banks that we owed energy sector debt, we had taken off the penal interest, negotiated the debt with them, and agreed what the debt was to everybody. And so ESLA was going to be collateralized, and based on a waterfall, everybody was going to get proportionally what he was due. They said, no, we don't want it. We'll float a bond. Today, as and when space comes in ESLA, like when they did the increase in ESLA, it's being mortgaged again to increase the length, take additional money and mortgage the bond. So we're going to continue paying ESLA for the God knows how many years more. It's mortgaged. We cannot remove ESLA because it has been collateralized for 10 years, 15 years or more. You see, and the point is every single fiscal space that you can use to leverage and put into production is being mortgaged by this government. A government that said we won't borrow and said that we had borrowed excessively. But the point is, whatever borrowing we did in my time, you could see the investment into which it was being put. You could see the infrastructure, you could see the roads, you could see the electricity, you could see the water. I mean, just tell me, 98 billion Ghana cedis down the line, show me what is there in capital expenditure in infrastructure. Show me one hospital. Show me a new secondary school. Show me a new water system. Show me roads. You just go and take asphalt and put it on an existing road and seal it, and then you say you're doing roads. Which new road have you tackled? None. And so that is the danger that we have. And so for me, my thinking is not about the election and the biometric register. I think, yes, somebody will win. For me, the greater thing that occupies my thoughts is after we have won, how are we going to adjust the reforms again? How are we going to reform so that we can put this economy back on a sustainable track? You are right. I don't regret that we went into the IMF because we needed policy credibility. Whatever we did, our international partners said, how are we sure that you will implement this, your homegrown fiscal program? We went to Senchi, we called everybody and said, come and let's think, we need a fiscal consolidation program. NPP refused to participate. The day before the Senchi program, they issued a fiat and said that any of their members who participated will be sanctioned. So they didn't come. Osafo had said he would come, he didn't come at the last minute. The only person who came was Kwame PNM and a few, but others who were active members of the party didn't come. And yet it is out of Senchi that we got the homegrown fiscal consolidation plan that we took to the IMF, and the IMF signed on it. They hardly changed anything in our homegrown fiscal consolidation plan. And one of the things that I'm proud of is we reduced central bank borrowing to 5%. And then in 2016, we reduced it to 0. So everything that was financed under government's expenditure was based on government's own revenue. Of course, it took our fiscal deficit up to 6 point something if you look at the rebase figures now. But, I mean, you could see discipline coming into public finance. Unfortunately, that discipline has been destroyed completely. And we will do our best. Our policy working group is looking at the figures and seeing what we need to do immediately after we take over, how we can restructure and put the economy back on a sustainable path of growth.
My name is Norman.